Hey everyone, welcome back to Threaducation. In this video, we're going to be talking about a brand that I'm sure many of you have heard about, but may not know the full history of. Marni burst onto the scene in recent years and was even deemed the most fun brand in fashion by GQ magazine, so the obvious question to ask here is, what is all of this buzz about? How has this relatively young fashion brand elbowed its way into the same conversation as some of the biggest names in fashion? Well, today we're going to be diving into all of that and much more, so without further ado, let's get into it. This is the history of Marni. Although Marni is technically classified as a luxury Italian brand, its founder, Consuelo Castiglione, was actually born and raised in Switzerland. What brought her to Italy was her husband, Gianni Castiglione, whose family owned an Italian fur company that was best known for providing furs to major luxury fashion houses, including the likes of Louis Vuitton, Dior, and Prada. Now, up until this point in her life, Consuelo had never really been exposed to the fashion industry and had certainly never considered it as a career path. But she was always a creative person, and now that she had all of these resources at her disposal, her natural inclination was to use them. Effectively on a whim, she joined forces with her husband and his sister Marina to design a collection exclusively made out of fur. This wasn't necessarily their first choice, it's just what they had available, but as we'll discuss later on, fur would become one of Marni's signature design elements. So as far as the collection itself, it's important to point out that not a single person involved had any formal training in the art of design. Sure, the Castigliones had plenty of knowledge about working with fur, but that could only take them so far, and there was a reason that they were leaving the rest up to the designers at these major fashion houses. But that's where Consuelo came in. Like I said, she too lacked formal design training, but rather than letting that deter her, she did the only thing she could do. She relied on her intuition. Acting as the creative force behind this collection, Consuelo first asked herself what elements of style she valued the most, and then tried to figure out ways to encompass those elements in a collection made with fur. The end result was a set of pieces unlike anything that the fashion industry was accustomed to. For context here, it's important to keep in mind that this was in the mid-1990s, and in the mid-1990s, the use of fur was usually reserved for high-end, ostentatious luxury garments. But this was not that. On the contrary, Consuelo's designs were the epitome of casual ready-to-wear. It was light, free-flowing, fit comfortably, and perhaps most notably, the fur was dyed in bright and bold colors, doing away with the natural agouti coloration that one might typically expect. All things considered, her design approach was cutting edge from the start, and honestly, I think that can be attributed to the fact that she didn't have formal training, and that her array of materials to pick from was relatively limited. She just found a way to make pieces that she liked, and the hope was that they'd resonate with others the way that they resonated with her. So that tells us a bit about how the first collection came to be and where some of the brand's principal design elements originated from. But now let's turn to the ever-important question of how this bridged the gap between being a passion project and actually being a viable business. Well, in that respect, the first challenge was establishing brand recognition. The unique silhouettes and use of fur was certainly a step in the right direction, but to establish brand recognition, you do of course need to pick a name for the brand. And by now you might be wondering, where in the world does the name Marni even come from? Well, as it turns out, the brand is actually named after Consuelo's sister-in-law Marina Castiglione, whose nickname within the family was Marni. Consuelo was the driving force behind the brand from the very start, but Gianni and Marina were there to help her get things off the ground, so you can sort of think about the brand's name as a tribute to her family and the role that they played in making all of this possible. Now, because Consuelo was offering something that wasn't already in the market, it didn't take long for the label to gain some traction. But the first major breakthrough, if you want to call it that, was the presentation of Marni's Fall/Winter 95-96 collection at Milan Fashion Week. Nowadays, most people see fashion shows as star-studded events that are, in a best-case scenario, designed to go viral on social media, and in a sense, that's what they are. But more traditionally, fashion shows are supposed to be opportunities for retailers to view collections and then decide whether or not they want to stock those collections in their stores. So in other words, fashion shows are, or at least were, a key part of helping new labels achieve mainstream commercial success. I mean, back then there really was no other way to do it, because this was before social media, and the infrastructure of online retail was nowhere near what it is today. So why am I mentioning all of this? Well, the buyers who attended the presentation of Marni's Fall/Winter 95-96 collection at Milan Fashion Week instantly fell in love with it, and this led to the label opening more than 20 new accounts with different retailers. Better yet, a number of these retailers were based outside of Europe, so this was Marni's first real step towards international expansion. So in a short amount of time, this had become a thriving business. For that reason, it was in 1999 that Marni actually split from the Castiglione family's fur company to become its own independent entity. Just to be clear, the Castiglione family was still running Marni, with Consuelo as creative director and Gianni helping manage the finances, but it had just gotten to the point where it was easier for logistical reasons. The brand now had its own revenue stream, it had its own employees, and it had its own suppliers. That last point is actually a particularly important one, because as the brand started to grow, it expanded its repertoire beyond just the use of fur. Don't get me wrong, fur would continue to be a defining part of Marni's identity as a brand, but remember that this started because in the beginning, that's all they really had access to. Now armed with more resources and tasked with giving fans new and exciting collections, Consuelo decided to widen Marni's offering, and she started by introducing fun and colorful prints. These prints would go on to become an equally important part of Marni's brand DNA, because beyond the fact that they're eye-catching, they really solidify the brand's youthful, energetic identity. So between the use of colorful furs and eccentric prints, Marni was really starting to establish brand recognition. And what makes this even more impressive is that it was establishing brand recognition without the use of conventional marketing tactics. In fact, Marni wasn't using any marketing tactics. Apparently, Consuelo had a few different campaigns planned during the mid to late 1990s when she was first starting out, but eventually scrapped them and decided to let her collections speak for themselves. Obviously, this is a risky strategy, and it's not one that I would recommend for just any brand trying to achieve mainstream popularity, but for Marni, it was possible because Consuelo knew that her signature design elements were all that people needed to identify her work. So in effect, the business model was this. She would present her collections on the runway, buyers would put them in retail stores, and there, customers would hopefully gravitate towards her pieces. And in more cases than not, they did because the pieces were so intriguing. So I guess you could say that Marni was employing a word-of-mouth / if you know type marketing strategy, as opposed to running commercials and renting out billboards. Like I said, it was a bit risky, but it didn't take long to see the payoff, because by the year 2000, Marni was selling so well at other retailers that they decided to open up their first ever flagship location in London. This was a major milestone in the brand's history because it meant that the demand for Marni had reached a point where it justified opening a standalone store. And in hindsight, this really was just the beginning, because nowadays there are several hundred Marni stores around the world. Anyways, going back to what I was saying about Consuelo's decision to increase Marni's offering, it was in her spring 2002 collection that she first debuted menswear. Up until this point, it had been all women's wear, so I guess you could call this a major milestone as well, but that's not really how she saw it. Years later, Consuelo would go on to say, "I would not distinguish between the Marni woman and the Marni man. They belong to the same universe." I mean, there were differences between her menswear collections and her women's wear collections, with the menswear collections mainly featuring traditional menswear pieces such as suits, and the women's wear collections mainly featuring traditional women's wear pieces such as dresses, but what I think she was trying to say is that she didn't approach the two any differently. Instead, she had her defined set of design principles that were present in every collection, and she'd then take those design principles and look to apply them in different ways. So things like fur and the unique prints are consistent throughout most Marni collections, but at the same time, no two Marni collections ever feel the same. Innovation is a key part of Consuelo's identity as a designer, and as is the case for most innovators, this means that she can see the potential in some things long before others can. One of the best examples of this is the Fussbed sandals. Objectively speaking, the Fussbed sandals are pretty clunky looking. They have a thick sole and wide overlapping straps that end up covering most of the foot, but the point is that they're comfortable and, if worn confidently, actually quite stylish. You don't have to agree with that, not everyone does, but that actually leads me to a funny story. You see, when Consuelo designed these sandals, her husband Gianni was the first to say that he didn't like them. Nevertheless, she assured him that they'd be a success, and as it turns out, she was right. The Fussbed sandals quickly became one of Marni's best-selling products, and as I'm sure you can imagine, that made Gianni, who ran the business side of things, very, very happy. So products like the Fussbet sandals helped push Marni further and further into the spotlight, but all things considered, the brand continued to maintain a relatively low profile, with no marketing and no major collaborations. Make no mistake, Consuelo did do a number of collaborations, but they were never with big-name brands. They were all with artists or musicians that she personally liked and wanted to work with, such as Sir Peter Blake, Richard Prince, Kim Gordon, and Gary Hume. Unlike most collabs these days, the intention here wasn't to create hype, but instead, the intention was quite literally just to collaborate with other creatives in an effort to make thought-provoking pieces. Honestly, I wish that more designers approached collabs this way, because the end result just feels so much more authentic. But I guess there's something to be said about the fact that there aren't many designers doing it this way. Even if done well, these types of collabs rarely have the same mass appeal that collabs with big-name brands and influencers do. So if your only goal in mind is rapid growth, it's definitely the harder path to follow. But despite all of that, Marni has continued to grow and grow and grow. Yet the most amazing thing about all of this is that the brand growth has just been so natural that it could almost be considered an anomaly in the modern fashion industry. By letting the work speak for itself, Consuelo entered Marni into the same conversation as some of the biggest names in fashion, which actually leads me to what I'd like to talk about next. Although Marni had entered into the same conversation as some of the biggest names in fashion, Consuelo and Gianni were well aware that they lacked many of the same resources. I mean, the brands that they were in competition with were backed by the likes of LVMH and Kering, both of which are multi-billion-dollar companies. The difference here is that conglomerates such as these are able to help brands within their portfolio by assisting with a lot of the logistics, including manufacturing, distribution, finances, and so on. So sure, Marni was bringing in millions of dollars on its own as an independent brand, but as it continued to grow, that became harder and harder to manage. So in 2012, Consuelo and Gianni made the decision to sell a majority stake in their label to Renzo Rosso's OTB Group, which also owns stakes in other labels such as Margiela, Jill Sander, Diesel, and Amiri. So clearly Marni was now in good hands, but it should come as no surprise that this was a major turning point in the brand's history. One of the first signs of change is that just a few years later, in 2015, Marni released its first ever marketing campaign. It was nothing over the top, but it was an obvious and somewhat sudden pivot from the brand's approach in the past, and it's one that would stick because nowadays Marni stages marketing campaigns on a fairly regular basis. But anyways, it was in 2015, that same year, that the OTB Group purchased the remaining stake in Marni, thus making them the sole owner. And by this point, it had become pretty clear that the Castiglionis were ready to move on. To that end, it was in 2016 that Consuelo officially announced that she'd be stepping down as creative director so that she could focus more on her personal life. And while you have to respect that decision, it was certainly sad to see her go. I mean, Consuelo was Marni. The playful collections and empowering pieces were all born from the creative vision that she had for what fashion could be. And to be fair, she achieved that. So when she decided it was time to walk away, she had nothing left to prove. Her final collection as creative director was Marni's Spring 2017 ready-to-wear collection, and it beautifully bookmarked the end of an amazing chapter in the brand's history. But it was not the final chapter, because with Consuelo having stepped away, the OTB Group was tasked with finding a new creative director. This search led them to a 33-year-old designer named Francesco Risso, and if I'm being honest, when they made the announcement, most people had no idea who he was. So the question here is, why did they pick him? Well, let's take a step back and start at the beginning. Francesco was born in Italy, and from a young age he naturally gravitated towards fashion. His earliest foray into the art form was rummaging through the closets of his family members and cutting things apart so that he could make pieces of his own. His grandmother, who was an accomplished tailor, took note of this and offered to teach him the basics of tailoring. From there on out, he never even considered doing anything else with his life, and so at the age of 16, he applied and was accepted to Palamoda, a fashion institute in Italy that is widely considered to be one of the best in the world. There he began his formal education, and when he was old enough, he decided to continue it by enrolling at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, where he studied garment architecture. His desire to learn did not end there, however, because after his time at FIT, he was accepted into Central St. Martin's, where he studied under the legendary Louise Wilson to earn his master's degree. So needless to say, he ended his studies with about as strong of a resume as you can get, and spent the next few years working under a handful of designers to gain hands-on experience. But his big break came in 2008 when he was invited to join Prada as a women's wear designer. I don't need to be the one to tell you that landing a role at a major fashion house such as Prada is extremely difficult, but Francesco had been trained at the highest level, and from what I've heard, it was his knitwear that convinced Miuccia Prada to bring him on board. Joining Prada gave Francesco the opportunity to learn from Miuccia, and in a sense, he sort of became her protege. But as much as he did learn from her, he was always conscious about staying true to himself. Oftentimes, members of the design teams at major fashion houses are expected to act like cogs in a machine, and I'm not saying that was the case here, but what I am saying is that Francesco had a unique approach to design, and he didn't want to lose sight of that while trying to execute someone else's vision. So he remained at Prada for a total of 8 years and saw great success during that time, but it's reasonable to believe that the thought of someday becoming a creative director had always been in the back of his mind. Now, something I should mention here is that throughout their careers, many people have compared Consuelo and Miuccia Prada, not because their work is all that similar, but because they were both at the forefront of creating comfortable, stylish, high-end women's wear. So when Consuelo announced that she was leaving in 2016, the OTB group wanted to bring in someone who could continue moving things in that direction while simultaneously providing some new ideas. I don't know this for certain, but my suspicion is that they wanted someone like Consuelo or like Miuccia, so who better than Miuccia's protege? Like I said, that's just me guessing what their thought process was, but whatever the truth may be, all we know is that they offered the position to Francesco and he jumped at the opportunity. He made his highly anticipated debut with the presentation of Marni's Fall/Winter 2017 collection, and trust me when I say that it was a strong first impression. What was truly brilliant about it is that Francesco was able to walk a very fine line, where he continued what Consuelo had started while adding his own personal flair. I mean, that's exactly what he was brought in to do, because people loved Consuelo's work and didn't want Marni to stray too far from the foundation that she had created, but the benefit of bringing in a new creative director is that they shake things up a bit, which is exactly what he did. If I had to describe it, I'd say that Francesco took many of Marni's signature design elements and then turned them up a notch. More colors, more prints, mohair, and fur would all become characteristic of his approach as creative director, and fans couldn't get enough of it. Among those fans are actually some big-name celebrities, including Rihanna, Kendall Jenner, Lil Uzi, Lil Yachty, and Jonah Hill, just to name a few. To be honest, it makes total sense that people with eclectic tastes in fashion have gravitated towards Marni, and because of that, the brand is growing larger and faster than ever before. According to one report, the total number of sales in 2022 is about 30% higher than it was in 2021, which is a massive increase. Part of this is thanks to the brand being seen on some of the celebrities I just mentioned, part of this is thanks to the sustained growth that began back when Consuelo was still creative director, and if I had to guess, I'd say a large part of this is thanks to Marni's inherent tendency to go viral. So allow me to explain, because historically speaking, Marni has of course strayed away from marketing and promotion, and unlike many other brands, never does anything gimmicky in an attempt to go viral. But look at pieces like the fur fussbet loafers or this striped shearling hat. These pieces are classic Marni and fit in perfectly with the brand's aesthetic, but there's no denying that they attract attention. They are naturally the statement piece of any outfit that you wear them with, which is why I think that so many people like them. Marni has plenty of low-key pieces, but these are the ones you see time and time again on social media, usually on celebrities, so this is a really good example of how Francesco's decision to turn things up a notch has helped create growth. So all of that said, I think Marni will be one of the most interesting brands to watch for in the coming years. Since his debut back in 2017, Francesco has released a number of stunning collections that simply cannot go unnoticed, and I should probably mention that he's not in this alone. His partner Lauren Steele actually holds the title of Associate Creative Director, and it goes without saying that they balance each other out very well, so I'm personally excited to see what they can accomplish together. Now for me, the really interesting question is what Consuelo and Gianni think about all of this. The brand has certainly changed a lot since they left, but remember, one of the main reasons that they sold it in the first place was so that Marni could compete with the major fashion houses. I think there's still a long way to go in that respect, but thanks to Consuelo's creative vision, and now under the guidance of Francesco and Lawrence, it's definitely headed in the right direction. What gives me the most confidence is that Marni is designed to be timeless. It's not made for a specific group of people, it's made for everyone, and it doesn't rely on trends or hyped up collabs. It relies on a set of fundamental design principles that fans have already come to know and love. So for that reason, I believe Marni is a name that we'll be hearing for a very, very long time to come. Anyways, that's just about all I wanted to cover in this video. I think it's a really interesting story, so hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you did, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more fashion content. Other than that, thank you all for watching Threaducation, and I will see you next time.